My name is Stanley Wany. I'm a artist publisher. I started in comics in 1996. Worked for Void Comics. I wrote and drew a comic book called Soul Slayer, um, which had like a pretty good run. Afterwards, I kind of left the world of comics and came back to it. Um, I have a degree in electrical engineering, actually. So I went to work for a bit, and after that came back in the world of arts in 2006. There I went back to school in art school. Right away, I started getting involved in the publishing side of the business. I started Trip Comics with somebody else for a while. That's when I published Agalma, my first graphic novel, which was nominated for a prize um, at the Toronto Comics and Arts Festival for Best Experimental Graphic Novel. After that, I published two other graphic novels, Dream Cave the following year, and then Sequences. Actually, both of these books are going to be gathered in one book. They're going to be published by Conundrum Press. We're working on that for next year, so stay tuned for that. My main influences in well, I should say visual arts because although I really love comics, the comic book artists were not my first influences. My greatest influences on the style that I draw are Gustave Doré, who's a 19th century French artist, and Sergio Topi, who's the Italian illustrator. I basically work with mixed medium type of collage type of thing. I draw in a style that's very reminiscent of collage. Um, I don't like boundaries, so I really mixed everything together. The style of storytelling that I use is non-linear. So to me, putting everything in boxes doesn't quite make sense. So I use China ink. I use a lot of acrylic medium. Um, I like cross hatching. I love. I think another one of my really big influences is Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese filmmaker who's extraordinary. I remember seeing his movies from like back when I was 8 years old and just being taken with the imagery. I think him and Gustave Doré have this commonality where the gray tones in their work is so profound that it's something that stayed with me like um, up until now. So yeah, that's basically the way I work, and I mostly work by improvising. So I will have these images which act as border instead of having um, squares in a page. I will just use an image as a border, and then from there I just improvise in between these main images. I just improvise in between, and this type of story I tell is really an improvisation, right? It comes from the left side of the brain. It's a very feminine way to tell a story. So that's why most of my heroes are always females, always like women. Yeah, I really love comics, but in a lot of ways, I find comics kind of restrictive in not only what they do, but how they do it. So in comics, you have so the medium of comics is considered as a language, as a way of saying things. And I find sometimes that could be kind of limiting because it could be so much more. I find the medium could be so much more. That's why I really like comic book creators that come from the visual arts or design because I think they bring so much more to the medium, not only as a way like graphically, but just a way like to tell the stories, you know. And like I say, like Akira Kurosawa is one of my biggest influence in the way I tell a story, because to me, like the question is, where does a story begin, right? That's like a so in movies and comic books, you go from A to B, and then you have this protagonist or this antagonist that moves the action along. But does the story really begin there? Like, what brought the conditions for your protagonist to be at this place at this time? That's the interesting part for me. There was this old show, this old cop show from the 50s. I remember. I don't something city. I don't remember the title. And basically, this girl got kidnapped. Her dad was rich, and then like the police went and got the girl, and they saved her, and they brought her back to the dad, and they said, "Oh, okay, this story ends well because you got your little girl back." And to me, I'm like, no, it's not. That's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of the story. Because when you think about it, what are the implications of that girl being kidnapped? What are the implications of her spending a night with like a bunch of thieves, and you don't know what happened, right? And what are the implications of what comes next in her life? To me, that's much more interesting than the whole like action adventure side of it. So to me, that's why I make comics a bit differently than like the mainstream, because these questions are never really, well, they are in some ways. I think if you look at a character like Batman, they'll take their time to like go that way, but in general it's not really something that's advocated in comic books. And me, that's my interest. So yeah, it's one of the reasons why I choose improv instead of writing a scenario prior. It's because I think improv leaves me space to go into those places where normally you wouldn't go. I remember when I was drawing, I think Sequences, my last graphic novel, I drew a picture in the beginning, and two and a half years or 3 years, because it takes me a long while to draw these things. Later, I was finishing the book, but then I was stuck someplace, and I didn't know how to end the story. I didn't know how to continue, how to like bridge the gap between what I had and the ending. And I was drawing stuff. I must have drawn like 10 pages, which I didn't use, and nothing worked. And then somehow I stumbled on that one imagery that I drew like 2 years and a half earlier. And I said, oh, what the hell? Let me just insert that there. And it worked perfectly. Like it worked perfectly. It moved the story along. It even had like a reference to another picture that I drew. And it was so natural. But that accident, I think that's what makes storytelling interesting. Like these little accidents that you have, these little things that you didn't account for, but happen by themselves almost. To me, that's what's interesting about storytelling in that way. Continuing on the whole accident theme, I think it's in 2018 I went to Finland, to Artelist Creative Center, which is an arts residency in Finland. And there I met like all kinds of amazing artists and so on and so forth. And coming back from that, it got me thinking about my whole creative process and in culture. And I think like it got me thinking about what I'm trying to say. And what I'm trying to say all through my comics and graphic novels is it's a comment about culture, like the culture we live in, and so on and so forth. And I remember when I was a kid, like I used to go down to Queens, New York at my uncle's. I used to spend the summer there. And coming from like, Canada, like white European safe culture, and going there, like I used to listen to like all these crazy movies and TV shows and kung fu films that were like dangerous and that would never be accepted like up in Canada, and I remember like really like wow, I was like awestruck. And then of course it was like the beginning of the 80s and hip hop was starting, and that whole vibe of like this emerging new art, and but I remember like at 4 o'clock in the neighborhood, in the neighborhood my uncle lived, it was like really multicultural. But at 4 o'clock, the ice cream truck, well, around 4 o'clock, the ice cream truck would like come around. And all these kids from all these different houses would like gather around the ice cream truck, and like have ice cream and so on and so forth. And I was like, oh, like this ice cream really like this this thing that encapsulates like all the wishes of all these kids from all these different backgrounds. And I said, oh yeah. And so I started the ice cream truck series, which again is a comment, about culture and bringing all these cultures, different cultures, in the same place around the ice cream truck. And so I started like this series of works on the ice cream truck. And I think like you have two of them in the show, in the Glass Axis show. So I'm really keen on like people seeing that and seeing like the whole um cultural like there are more, people need to realize there are more similarities than differences, you know even if like there's a lot of hype, a lot of noise about differences, but there's a lot more similarities. So I'm thinking about, if you just think about the whole Japanese rockabilly scene or the African dandy scene, it's like the same thing. It's the same energy that percolates like into the two movements. So to me, it's really interesting bringing those together in one place around the ice cream truck. So that's why these works are called the ice cream truck series. It brings me back to like that time when I was a kid, where everybody would meet around the ice cream truck. So that's where my work is going. And of course, an artist cannot be, you can't escape your surrounding, your realities. An artist is influenced heavily by the reality in which he or she lives in. So like the whole like social movement that we're in now, I think I've always had like this thing where I would like be polite about talking out about like social issues and so on. I think now I'm a bit more direct talking about it. So that kind of changed a bit like the way I work. But I mean, again, we go back to like the accident, the need to show how culture um, is something that brings us together than more than takes us apart. I think that's where my work is at now, and that's where I think it'll continue to be, for a while. With the whole COVID situation, which to me, the way I reacted to it is I even like basically artists are are isolated islands anyways, right? But I think what the COVID did for me is like push me further down the rabbit hole, you know. So we have like my oldest is 7 and he has like respiratory problems. So there's no chance for us. Like we can't take any chances. So we've been isolated at home. We haven't gone out, and I think to me it kind of showed up in my work in the fact that when I think about COVID, I think of COVID as like a mirror to where society is, which is really interesting to me because if you think about art, that's exactly what art does, right? Art is a mirror to where the society is. You know, this artist that I absolutely hate. I know people, Jeff Koons and like all the rest of them. I might hate Jeff Koons, but to me, what he does is a mirror to the society. And I think as an artist, you can't help but make a comment on society, even if because up here in Canada, in Ottawa especially, we have this thing that we call safe art. You know, these artists creating art that not necessarily they don't say anything about the environment or whatever, but I mean the art says something about the artist and where she or he is at at the moment. And to me, you like you can't criticize that because that's the person's reality. If that person's reality is a safe reality, of course that's what that person is going to create, right? But to me, art needs to take people further outward. You know, art needs to connect people. Art can be for enjoyment. You know, you can show beauty in art, but art it can't just be for enjoyment. At some point art has to do what it has to do, which is reflect on what the society is and where society is. And right now I can't to me I can't see art being this safe space where you create beauty and you get along and whatever, or you create riches where your pieces are in gold and whatever. Like to me it doesn't make sense, right? Art needs to like validate or invalidate where the society is. And again, it brings us back to the beginning when we were talking about comics, um, sometimes not going far enough. You know, I know there have been some recent, efforts in comics to like address certain issues, but I mean, it needs to go far enough. Like stuff like installations, art installations that really collage photography that really like are right in the middle of this, performance that's right in the middle of this that has something to say about the reality. To me, that's what art should, it's not only what it should do or be, but it should be heavily included. And if we say that art is influenced by its reality, its surrounding, then to me, like the majority of the art should have like this energy, this change, this, environmentalism, social changes, economic changes, and so on and so forth. Like you can't say you're an artist or do art and not talk about these things. Right? And then, to me, it's always like the comment that I made in what I created. But with COVID, I think I'm more direct about it, you know, instead of instead of being, Jimi Hendrix, and singing about stuff at, at the third person and in that originality that Jimi Hendrix is. I might be more like Fela Kuti, who addresses things directly and who's more brazen about it. So that's to me that's what COVID has kind of pushed me towards. And again, I think it's somewhere that I was always gonna end up. in, but COVID has kind of accelerated that.